The door swung on its hinges, and the smell came first. Cigars, perfume, hot dust from the street. Piano keys stumbled in the parlor. Boot heels paused on the threshold. A woman in a dark dress glanced up from a poker table, a black ribbon at her throat, the yellow lamplight slick on her cheek. A stranger had stepped into Fannie Porter's place on the corner of Durango and South San Saba in San Antonio, and in that instant, everyone weighed him. Lawman or customer, Pinkerton or cattle hand, trouble or the kind of man who tipped in gold. The new arrival nodded to the madam behind the polished desk. She didn't stand. She didn't flinch. She simply looked at him the way she looked at everyone, cool, measuring, and ready to decide whether he was worth the risk. The house had a reputation. By the late 1890s, the sporting district ran on cash, discretion, and speed, and Fannie kept hers cleaner than most. Fresh linens, chilled bottles, girls who bathed, dressed well, and knew to vanish down the back stairs the moment a badge flashed at the door. Cowboys drifted through, celebrating paydays. So did men the posters called desperados: Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, Harvey Kid Curry Logan. The Wild Bunch used San Antonio as a railroad hub and a hideout between jobs. They came through in twos and threes, changed names with every town, and liked a room where no one asked questions. Fannie understood supply and demand, and she also understood the weight of silence. One woman poured whiskey for a tall, sandy-haired rail worker who wasn't a rail worker at all. Another dealt cards to a man using a name that would only last the week. A third, pretty and quiet, watched the door the way Fannie watched it, counting who came in and who left. The girls here were young, some barely past 19, and they held their shoulders straight, like soldiers in silk. They had their own rules: cash up front, clean clothes, no drunken brawlers. If a man broke the rules, Fannie herself appeared in the doorway with a warning sharp as glass: "Not in my house." Outside those walls, the district earned its nickname honestly. San Antonio was a river town with soldiers, stockmen, and trains, and that meant money, gambling, and fights. Policemen made raids when they needed headlines. Judges levied fines that functioned like taxes. The system kept the city running and the houses open. Fannie was arrested more than once and paid her way out without complaint, the same way a saloon paid its license. She didn't pretend her business was something else. She insisted it be orderly. The Outlaws liked that. Logan, Kid Curry, met a woman here who used the name Annie Rogers, later known as Della Moore. She was smart, pleasant, and quick with a read. She followed him for a time, then worked again in San Antonio when the law closed in. Laura Bullion, the thorny rose, spent time around the house and around the gang, helping pass stolen notes and gear. Another girl, Lily Davis, caught the eye of Will Carver. Etta Place, still a mystery, maybe a teacher, maybe not, moved in the orbit of the Sundance Kid and was said by some to have first crossed paths with him in this city. Some of those connections are documented. Some are rumors that hardened into lore. In this line of work, names shifted as often as trains. The risks shifted too. Violence wasn't a story the girls read about. It was the street outside their door. Men settled grudges with gunfire in the saloons and on the corners. When the Wild Bunch came down off a job, they brought heat with them. Detectives, wanted posters, sudden knock-and-enter searches. William Pinkerton himself traveled to Texas to ask questions. He didn't get answers from Fannie. She had a reputation there as well. She would cooperate with the law when the law came in uniform and on schedule, but she would not betray a man who had paid and kept order under her roof. The city learned to accept lines like that. You could draw them in chalk and then in blood. The stories about the girls travel in the same dust as everything else from the period, half record, half recollection. What can be said plainly is that several women tied to the house and the men who used it disappeared from the paper trail just as surely as some of the outlaws did. One left for Arkansas and changed her name. Another turned up later working again in Texas. A third is rumored to have gone straight, perhaps even teaching school. Etta Place stepped onto a ship for South America and stepped off into a fog of conflicting reports that never lifted. When people say Fannie Porter's girls were murdered, they're pointing at the climate around them. A city that tolerated vice while pretending it didn't. A gang whose members died by bullet or rope, and a business where the women were the most vulnerable people in the room. That era produced genuine killings by the dozen. It also produced legends. Sorting one from the other demands caution. The caution wasn't romantic, it was survival. Fannie watched the district evolve and made adjustments. When a landlord decided he didn't want the wild bunch under his roof anymore and canceled her lease, she built a workaround, a call system before anyone called it that, with runners and notes from saloons to a boarding house, matching known men to known women under her eye. She kept her books light and her footprint lighter. She hosted a farewell party when the Outlaws pulled up stakes in 1901, and then, as the new century swept in reform and pressure, she folded her business into private rooms and finally stepped away. After that, she vanished into the same silence she had once sold. Rumors say marriage, or a return to England, or death in a car wreck decades later. Nothing firm. The city repurposed the old brothel building into a daycare. Children played where the piano had stood. What remains are the fixed points. The house stood on Durango and South San Saba in the heart of the sporting district. The Wild Bunch used it as a safe stop. Annie Rogers, Della Moore, was arrested passing outlaw money, acquitted, and later worked again in Texas. Laura Bullion was photographed by the Pinkertons and did time before she lived out a long, quiet life far from the frontier. Etta Place's trail ends in unanswered questions. Through it all, Fannie kept a clean parlor, a hard eye, and a broom close by, close enough to chase off an officer if he came in on her terms instead of his. The darker points are real too, even when names blur. This was a time and a trade where women's deaths often went uninvestigated and unreported unless a scandal boosted sales. If a girl from a house like Fannie's turned up dead in a ditch outside town, the city might have called it misadventure and moved on. If she simply stopped showing up to work, people assumed she'd taken the next train under a different name. The danger sat in the middle of the room, pouring itself a drink. The girls measured men for it every night. There's a reason the story won't let go. Part of it is the shine of famous names brushing against a quiet doorway, turning a working house into a stage where legends passed a hat and left tips on the dresser. Part of it is the simple truth that the women were there, living and choosing inside a narrow set of options, surrounded by men who carried guns and problems. The Wild Bunch died hard. The women who knew them lived with that heat blowing through every curtain. You can feel it even now. The clink of glass, the way voices dropped when the door opened, the way a young woman's eyes flicked to the mirror to mark who stood behind her. The stranger in the doorway took off his hat that night and smiled the soft smile of a man who wanted to be liked. Fannie rose at last, smoothed the skirt she'd chosen for the evening, and decided how the next hour would go. She took his measure. She always did. The piano found its rhythm again. Laughter returned, practiced, and a little brittle. A girl on the stairs caught the madam's glance and knew it meant, be careful. Down here, in this city at the edge of the new century, caution was the only insurance anybody sold. In the end, the ledger that matters, names in the city directory, a photograph in a detective's file, a night clerk's note about a room, shows how thin the line is between what's known and what's only told. Fannie's house was real. The women were real. The violence around them was real. Who killed whom, and when, and why? Those answers run out faster than the stories, The shadows last longer than the record. That's the truth the district still carries like perfume in the walls. Thank you for listening to The Lantern's Tale. Subscribe for more true stories if you dare.